Garage Geeks Summer Travel Part 2. Hi, welcome back to Part 2. So in Part 1, I talked about how I went from Boston to Cape Cod. Now I'm going to be talking about how I'm traveling north from Cape Cod to Acadia National Park and then to my friend's house in Pennsylvania. So leaving Cape Cod National Seashore, the first obvious stop was Plymouth. So Plymouth is very famous in the United States because it is where the Pilgrims first landed, and I was very excited to see Plymouth Rock. But the first thing that we saw was the Mayflower II, very beautiful ship sitting in a beautiful harbor, great park. But then you walk up to the Plymouth Rock and it's in this like Greek temple. It's so cool. When you look down on the rock, it's just, it's just a big rock sitting there. And, that's fine. I was warned that, hey, it's just a rock. And it is. But there's so much with it that it's more than just a rock. But what's even cooler is you cross the street and there is overlooking the entire harbor and including the rock. There is a statue to Massasoit. Right next to it is a plaque. And this is how I feel history should be done. The plaque writes about how Native Americans gather on that hill on Thanksgiving as a kind of mourning for what happened to them, to help us remember the other side of Thanksgiving, which is not a Thanksgiving for the Native American population. And I really think that this is important. And my only problem with it is it's too small. It should be bigger. In fact, there was a couple there, I assume they were from England, and they walked right past the rock and they were looking at it and they were talking, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, hey, you really should read this. And when they started reading them, I heard them gasp and everything. I'm like, so I was walking away because, it's the real history and it puts it into perspective. About a mile from that, there is a national monument to the forefathers. And in the guidebook that I read online, it's like this monument isn't downtown with everything else, and it's kind of ignored. And when I went there, I saw that there weren't many people. In fact, the whole time I was there, 2 other cars. As you pull in, you're astounded by how large this monument is. Holy crap, this monument is huge. It's beautiful, very classical in nature, and just getting out and walking around it, you're kind of awed. It's a beautiful monument, and it's too bad that more people don't go and visit it. So as we were driving up, Bob noticed that we were driving through Quincy. He was like, oh, let's stop. And I'm like, okay. And we looked it up while I was pulling out the exit, and it's actually a national parks site. And so I was very happy with that. Oh, by the way, I got the Mayflower II and a magnet while I was in Plymouth. So here's the stamp for the Adams National Historic Park. Now, this was another place that was really big, and I don't seem to have my brochure with me. Maybe I didn't even get one, which is a shame. So we went into the museum and the bookstore, and just like always, the first thing we try to do is to watch the movie to get a little bit more of a sense of the history of the place. And so this was a monument to the Adams family, which kind of made me laugh when I said this, but also the Quincy family that kind of married in together, and the 2 presidents, John Adams, and then of course John Quincy Adams, and then other members of the family. And the video was really informative. And then as we were walking around, we were able to go to the crypt where both presidents are buried along with their spouses. And this is where I discovered something. Bob likes to go see the grave sites of the presidents. And I didn't know that he was trying to get them all, and I don't think he did either. And so from this point on, we hit every dead president's grave site that we can, and I think I ended up seeing 5 with him on this trip. And this was a good starting point because we got a twofer. We got 2 presidents at once. Now, what's really interesting is Laura Linney, who was one of the narrators of the museum video, she pronounced it Kinsey, which was interesting. I'm not going to change my pronunciation. I'm just going to say John Quincy Adams. But it was interesting that I guess it's pronounced John Kinsey Adams, and maybe even the city of the town is called Kinsey. After Plymouth and Quincy, we went right through Boston. At this point, Bob really didn't want to stop, but I was like, Bob, I can't let Boston kick my ass. I've got to go back, and I have to hit that one site that I didn't get to see, which was the Bunker Hill Monument. And boy, am I glad that I did, because that monument was so cool. Now, the monument is an obelisk, and it looks like the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C., but I think that one's over double the size. But this one, when you enter the museum, they're like, hey, do you want to climb up it? And it's free. And I was like, yeah. It's 294 steps, but I had a problem because I knew that Bob was waiting and he couldn't climb it. And so I rushed through it. I went the whole 294 steps, and you have to go back down. And everybody's using the same path going up and down. By the time I was done doing that, great view from the top. But when I got to the bottom, my legs were shaking because I had gone so fast because I didn't want him waiting. But I'm so glad that I did that monument. And so now in Boston, I'm really only missing the two places in between. Like, one of them is the Old North Church. Sometime in my life, I'm going to go back to Boston. I'm going to do those other two sites. So from there, we drove north and we stayed at Lynn. Now, Lynn is where I have that hippie Airbnb, which I featured in another video I just did recently. Before we checked in, we went the 6 miles to Salem. Now, I wanted to go back to Salem because of a couple of reasons, but the one main reason is the first time I went to Salem, I parked, and I didn't realize it, but I was parked right next to the cemetery, and I walked a huge circle, and by the time I got back to the cemetery, they closed. Now, I was able to see a monument to the victims of the Salem witch trials, and it's pretty moving. Each stone, there's a separate stone for every victim, and it says how they died. But this time I was able to walk through the graveyard, and I think I was expecting more. I thought that maybe the victims were buried in there, and they might have been. I didn't have time to research, but at least I got to walk through the graveyard. And then I went into the shop, and I was very underwhelmed by the shop. On hindsight, I could have skipped that because I'd seen everything. I just didn't get to walk through the graveyard because it was closed. But it wasn't anything really different than any of the other graveyards. And so then we went back to our hotel. As we were leaving the next morning, I was like, we went right by it. I'm like, let's stop in Danvers. Now, Danvers is where the Salem witch hysteria started, and they have the most beautiful, and I'm saying this monument is so touching. I visited it last year, and I was feeling quite down because of my vacation, and this monument, which is a monument to religious intolerance, I don't know why, it raised my spirits. It is so sad. I know why it raised my spirits, because I was feeling down about my travel because of all of the rain, being tired. When I got to Salem, I was very disappointed because it wasn't what I was expecting it to be. It's basically a town that caters to the silly Halloween, kind of year-round Halloween idea of witches and goblins and, monsters, and that's not what Salem is about at all. It's about the religious intolerance. And so when I got to Danvers, I was able to see that. And that monument is so touching. So I was able to go back to it and see it when it wasn't raining. On the monument itself, there is a quote from each person's trial. And then each one is a plea of their innocence and how in the eyes of God they will be justified for their innocence. And then right below it, it shows how they were killed. It's so disturbing, but so well done. It's one of the best monuments that I think I've ever been to. So from there, we had to make the long drive to Acadia National Park. So Acadia National Park is in Maine. And by the time we got to the hotel, we were tired. So we didn't actually go into the park that night. But the next morning, we got up bright and early. We grabbed breakfast that we brought into the park. We grabbed the brochure. We started planning out our day. And the first thing that we found out is that there's a mountain there called Cadillac Mountain. And if you want to go on Cadillac Mountain in the national park, you actually have to make a reservation. And you have to actually pay, which is very strange. But I went ahead and made the reservation, and I understood why they did it after I got to the top, because there's very few places to park, and they have to stagger the people through. And even while we were there, it was so busy, and we were we got there, we took the 9 o'clock slot, and so we were pretty early in the morning. When we went to the top, it was overcast, but it was still beautiful. But later in the day, the sun came out and cleared away all the clouds, and I bet going up to Cadillac Mountain at that time would have been stunning. As it was, I went all through the mountain, walking on both sides of it. It was really, really beautiful. So after the mountain and going a little bit along on the loop road, I realized that most of this park is going to be scenic mountains and beaches, which was fine. As we drove the loop road, Bob was hankering to go on a boat ride. So we actually went into Bar Harbor. We got on a boat and we did like an 1.5-hour tour of the bay. And it was really, really beautiful. I'm glad that we did that. And then afterwards, we went back to the park and finished the loop road, stopping at various places. And at that time, the sun had cleared up the day. Every place was gorgeous. The beaches were gorgeous. Everything in the park was really, really pretty. And even though I only spent one day in the park, I did get to see a lot of it. Of course, I didn't get to do any of the hikes, and there seemed to be some interesting hikes there. But for an introduction to that park, hopefully I'll be able to go to that park again sometime in my lifetime. As an introduction to that park, it was a good one. That night, after we got back to the hotel, I did, or the night before, I did a 300-piece puzzle. 300 piece is not very big, but it still took me a while, especially because of the pattern. There were a lot of the same colors: reds, whites, yellows, blacks, and getting the patterns together was interesting. So it was a fun puzzle. I always try to do my puzzles without looking at the boxes, so I was able to complete that puzzle without doing that. So getting back to my friend's house in Pennsylvania was going to be a 2-day trip. So on the first day, as we were driving, we got to see Franklin Pierce's grave. So this is our third dead president. Then we stopped at the Marsh-Billings Rockefeller National Historic Site. So this one was actually in Vermont. So from going to Maine to get back to Pennsylvania, or to go to Pennsylvania, we had to go through Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts, I believe. So there is the national park sticker for the Marsh-Billings Rockefeller. Now, even though we couldn't stay there very long, we did tour the grounds a bit. We weren't able to do the house tour, which is really unfortunate. So I actually hope I can go back there sometime. But we watched the movie, and the movie was so informative. It was like a family history and why that place is set aside. The 3 successive owners of that property was very into conservationism. In fact, the first one bought the property because the logging industry was killing the virgin forests of Vermont, so much so that there was starting to be massive floods and it was washing away all the topsoil. They had to quickly go in there and plant a whole bunch of trees to stop all the flooding. And it went from there. It was a really interesting documentary. If it's available on YouTube, I would recommend people watch it. From there, we went to the Calvin Coolidge grave site. Now, this one was really interesting because there wasn't much fanfare. And when we went up, I actually made a mistake because the tallest grave, there's a whole line of Coolidges, and the tallest one in the middle isn't the president's. It's actually the grandfather's. And Calvin Coolidge's is off to the side in the row with just like a little flag in front of it. And you would think that being a president, he would have a much bigger grave stone, but he didn't. So I'm wondering, I actually have to research this later. I'm wondering if, I remember that there was at least one president with Quaker or Puritan roots or background, and I'm wondering if that played into this and how the grave was set up. But it was a very small cemetery, very quiet, very, very beautifully laid out, and it was on a hillside, and it was a very nice grave site. So that's the 4th dead president I saw on this trip. There's going to be one more. So that night we actually stayed in the countryside, and we went to an elevated tent that was kind of in the woods. Now, this was on somebody's farm, and as you walk in, you park, and then they have like a wheelbarrow cart. You put all your stuff on it. You follow the arrows through a path of cut grass until you get to a section of woods. And when you enter the woods, then you see the elevated tent. It was so cool. I think this was my favorite place of all that we stayed on the trip. It was just nice because there wasn't any electricity there. They did have a small like, not generator, like battery that you could plug things into, but we didn't even plug in the lamp. When it got dark, we just went to bed, and it was kind of nice. I would like to actually go there for about a week and get into the rhythms of that. You would just kind of like detox there. It was such a cool place. Now, the next morning when I woke up, one thing is I wouldn't use the bathroom. I hate outhouses with a passion. They smell so bad. So when I actually had to pee, I peed in the woods. And I had to be careful because there was poison ivy all over that place. But in the morning, this is going to sound strange, but it was really freeing to just take off all my clothes and use an outdoor shower. Now, it wasn't outdoor. Like it had wood around it with a shower curtain. But it was really neat to like hook up the machine and turn on the hot water. And then afterwards, I got a cup of tea by opening up a water spigot that they have there. They had like a big jug, and then boiled the water on like a campsite stove. It was really a lot of fun to be at that place. The next day is the last day before we got to my friend's house, but we had a full day. So we went to the Clark Institute, which I made a video about. Beautiful, stunning. If you haven't seen that, it's just a slideshow of all the art that I saw, and there was a lot more that I didn't take pictures of, but I was shocked at how many amazing paintings and art pieces that this museum had. Definitely a world-class museum. And then we went into the Berkshires and we went to the Mount, which is Edith Wharton's mansion. I think I talked about that in another video, but she only lived there 10 years. She was expecting to live there a lot longer. She actually built the mansion and designed it, and it's all based on the ideas of symmetry and clean lines. It was such a beautiful place to visit, and I am so glad that I went on the tour. And the last stop that we made was we saw our final dead president of the tour, and that was Van Buren in a little town of Kinderhook. All right, I'm going to end this video by talking about what we did yesterday, because we had a very, very strange day. I planned out the day and I'm responsible for it. So I was looking at things to do around my friend's house, and I've actually been here quite a few times. So I was looking for something different, and I found out that in this town called Owego, which is about 30 miles from here, maybe 40, they were doing a local production of Sunday in the Park with George. And I am a huge Sondheim fan. I would not mind sharing why I love musicals and why in particular I love Sondheim. If anybody is interested in that, I would go ahead and break down some of Sondheim's lyrics, explain what he's trying to do, just give kind of a rundown of some of his musicals and why I think he's one of the greatest lyricists of musicals that we've ever had. If you're interested in that, please let me know in the comments. It certainly would be a bunch of work, but I wouldn't mind doing it if people were actually interested in it. So we left early because there were a couple things to do in Owego. There were 4 things that I wanted to do. Of course, we were going to have dinner there and then go to the theater. It actually started to rain, which was a bummer. But when we got there, we went to this really old antique mall, and it was really nice. It was 2 floors of different antiques, and everything was wildly overpriced. There were some deals to be had. There were a lot of records. I wish I could have gone through and, grabbed a bunch of records. Shipping records back, I didn't want to have to deal with all that. There were books, there were knickknacks, there were, typical antique mall. But it was really great to spend some time in there. We went there first because it was going to close. And so after that, we went to this really large bookstore. And I was excited to go to this bookstore because it looked quirky. And it was a fun bookstore, but it didn't have the kind of books that I was interested in. It was mostly an antiquarian bookstore, so very expensive volumes of very old books, and I'm just not into that at all. So after looking around that bookstore, I spent way less time than I was expecting. After taking a few pictures, I was there about 30 minutes left. We ate, then we we went along the river. We did a river walk, and there are a bunch of plaques there noting how the Army went through, and because the Native Americans were being hostile, they went ahead and burned their village. And there's a plaque to all that there, and I mean, just gruesome American history. But what a beautiful, it's like a 2-block walk that goes along the river, the Susquehanna River. Beautiful. So then we go to the community theater, and I was kind of nervous because the ticket for me was $30. My friend's was $25 because, he got a senior discount. And with that prices and being a community theater, you never know what you're going to get. Sometimes they are just awful, and sometimes they're really good. It all just depends on a bunch of factors. But I'm happy to report that Sunday in the Park with George was a success they did a great job. I enjoyed the production so much. If you're not familiar with Sunday in the Park with George, so it's a musical. Most of the musical is about George Seurat, who created the painting. It's not called Sunday in the Park with George, but it's got a long title. And the musical is the artist struggling with being an artist and what it takes to be a devoted artist, and the effects that have on the people that you love in your life. What is art, and what did he do to try to create the art, and the effect of the art. Sondheim was so good at getting us to see what he was trying to do and how he was creating the art. Successful musical, thoroughly enjoyed it. As we were leaving, it was dark. It was already 10:30. Driving home, and there was a sign that says, next 4 miles, Deer Crossing. This story is not gonna end well. Oh, so I was driving. I was going 60 miles an hour. It was dark. I mean, but normally fine. But someone had just hit a deer, and I couldn't avoid it. The deer was in the road. It was huge. It was already dead, thank God, because that would have traumatized me. But I went right over that deer, and that thing was huge. The whole car went up in the air. I mean, I just kept going because I didn't know what else to do. I didn't want to swerve. I didn't want to slam on the brake. I mean, it happened so fast. And that's how accidents happen, right? I'm just so thankful nobody got hurt, right? We were both fine, but, I wasn't driving my own car. I was driving my friend Bob's, and he was, of course, upset. He's still upset. This morning when I went down, he started saying, I'm like, Bob, I'm ready for the tongue lashing, just go. And I only said I let him say what he needed to say. He needed to get it off his chest, how I was driving too fast, blah, blah, blah. But it was unavoidable. I mean, I don't know how I could have avoided not hitting that deer. And I think if he were driving, he would have hit the deer too. It turns out like it did dislodge the bumper, and we need to get new tires. There are like big bubbles in the tire. I mean, that deer was huge. And so there's going to be some consequences to pay, because of, hitting that deer. But I'm just thankful nobody got hurt. That's all I really care about. I don't care about the money. I don't care about anything else. Both of us are fine. Unfortunately, the deer isn't. I mean, I felt so bad for that deer. I am just so glad that deer wasn't still alive when I hit it. At least I hope it wasn't. And I'm glad that I hit a dead deer, because I went full force right. It was laying this way and I went right over it. Ugh. And that is like the worst way to end my vacation. I'm like all traumatized. I went from hitting a deer. Tomorrow we're going to go to his sister's house. We might tour one more national park site, and then the next morning get up early, flying out of Newark to Los Angeles, and I will be back home. So that was the second part of my vacation. I hope you were here for both parts. Again, it's a self-indulgent travelogue, but if you enjoy my channel and you watched both and you want to put any comments, I'm really thankful for all the support. Yeah, I'm just gonna remind you all to don't be like me. Don't run over any deers, and then, just always try to be more intelligent.